So in this episode, we are going to talk about when and how to fire an employee. And we're going to have a lot of tidbits. So if you want to stay in touch and you want to stay tuned, please make sure you subscribe below. In this episode, you're going to hear the one thing that you should do before you fire an employee. When should you fire an employee? There are certain red flags that come up for a business that should be the timing of when you're going to let this employee go. Number one, are they violating your handbook policies? You should have, at the inception of your onboarding with an employee, a review of your handbook with the employee, because the employee handbook sets out the rights and responsibilities of both the employer and the employee. So when you see that the employee is violating a specific policy, as an example, let's say that they're violating the meal break policy. It's a fairly simple one, but let's say that you give them an hour for a lunch break and they decide to take 3 hours lunch break where your employee handbook specifically says they can only take an hour. So the fact that they've broken it should start the conversation with the employee in terms of what your handbook policy says and what are the consequences of that. Now, I would never give advice to an employer to fire their employee simply for breaking a policy for a lunch break, but that is the time that an employer should start to think about how many steps need to be taken before the actual termination takes place. There are more grievous examples. If an employee is stealing from the company or has committed some type of crime, then obviously the conversation for terminating employee would happen much quicker. It's a violation that warrants termination, and so you should let them go right away. The steps to firing an employee really go back to your handbook. An employee handbook is really the Bible for every company, because not only does it set out the rights and responsibilities that an employer and an employee should abide by, but it also talks about the steps that an employee or an employer would take. So since we're talking about termination, let's say that you have an employee that has violated a policy. What do you do next? Well, the next step is to refer back to the handbook and see whether you have a step-by-step termination process or protocol. Does your policy say that it warrants a written write-up first or a verbal write-up first? If so, then that's the step you take first. Is it a type of policy violation that you are allowed to skip the steps and go straight to termination? Then that's what you do. So the manner within which you terminate an employee should be guided by how you set that process up in your handbook. Most times it's not as cut and dry, and there's some other issues surrounding the employee, and you don't necessarily want to stick to just following the steps. And an example of that is, let's say that this employee who has violated a policy in your handbook told you a week ago that they have been recently diagnosed with cancer. And so they go out on leave, and you discover while they're out on leave that they violated a policy. Well, your handbook says if they violate a policy, you do steps 1, 2, 3. But now you have to take into account that they have either time off because of the FMLA, or they now have a possible disability. So there's other things that you need to think about, but going to your handbook is always the first step. If you want advice, please feel free to call our office, and we'll be happy to set up a consult for you.